we're very happy to have Annette Krauss, Emily Pethick, and Marina Vishmidt here, online and in person. And they'll be presenting the paper Unexpected Places of Learning, which will also be a bit of a conversation between the three of them. Hopefully technology permits. Let's pray. Just in terms of a short introduction to all of them. So first of all, Annette, who's here with us, works as an artist, writer, and educator. In her research-based practice, she addresses the intersection of art, politics, and everyday life with a focus on unlearning institutional responsibilities and questions of privilege. She co-initiated various long-term collaborative practices, including hidden curriculum, sites of unlearning, read in and read the masks, tradition is not given, and school temporalities. Meanwhile, Emily Pethick, who's coming in from London, has been the director of the Rijksacademy in Amsterdam since 2018. She was previously the director of the Showroom London and the director of Casco Office for Art, Design and Theory in Utrecht and curator of Qubit in London. She has contributed to various publications and co-edited books, including monographs on, oh gosh, I'm so bad with Dutch names, sorry. Wijndelin van Oldenburg, Ricardo Basbaum, Dave Holfish Bailey, and the Otolith Group. Whereas Marina Vishmidt, who is, I think, dialing in from Vienna, is that true? No, also London, soon Vienna, is a writer and editor. She teaches at Goldsmiths, University of London, but soon Vienna. Her work has appeared in a South Atlantic Quarterly, Art Forum, After All, Journal of Cultural Economy, Eflux Journal, Australian Feminist Studies, Moose, and Radical Philosophy, among others. She has also edited a number of volumes, including Speculation for the Documents of Contemporary Art series, which is published by Whitechapel and MIT Press. And she is the co-author of Reproducing Autonomy with Kirsten Steckelmeyer, and the author of Speculation as a Mode of Production, Forms of Value, Subjectivity in Art and Capital by Brill and Haymarket in 2018-19. We welcome you both, and we're very much looking forward to the talk, and we'll have questions afterwards. Thank you, Annette.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the invitation. And actually, I will give right away the floor to Emily, because we try to stick to our circulation, how we talked about it before, when Emily was still supposed to be here sitting next to me. But we try it out. We improvise on the go. So in case there are problems with like sound, please give signs and we try to fix it somehow. Emily.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I'm really sorry I'm not there. I was really looking forward to it. But I woke up quite sick this morning, so I had to join online instead. And I know there's lots of old friends around, so I'm definitely having FOMO. Also not to be with Marina and Annette physically at any point during this conversation. But I want to just give a brief introduction. So this conversation started, I think, already in 2014 around Annette's project, Hidden Curriculum, which looked at informal knowledge production and hidden spaces of learning within institutional settings, such as the school, and how outside of a formal curriculum, other kinds of knowledge were being created and shared. So we continued the conversation. That was when I was working at Casco in Utrecht, through the book called Curating and the Educational Turn. And then I think that was in 2010. Yeah, so the other conversation was in 2007, actually, I think. So anyway, since then we went, at that point we were connecting via the showroom, actually, where I was working in London. And where I continued to collaborate with both Marina and Annette on different projects. More recently, we're all involved in education in different ways. The second conversation we had was around the book, The Curating and the Educational Turn. And so that sparked in our conversation a question about what happened to the educational turn, as it was a term that we felt quite kind of distanced from now. And I think, well, we started off discussing that term. Marina remembers it as being quite ubiquitous at the time, but it's less present as a point of reference now. And perhaps it was a time when many of those concerns and methods have been assimilated into discursive formats of contemporary art. In the period this was a term was in discussion, there were spaces like, there were quite a lot of new initiatives like the Centre for Possible Studies at the Serpentine Gallery, which coincided with wider approaches to connecting art in a wider social context, and practices that were working with open-ended processes of exchange, which was actually how we were working a lot at the showroom, involving artists such as Annette and theorists such as Marina. So I was thinking about this kind of capturing of, or the use of terms such as the turn, that was trying to, in a way, kind of trying to capture processes that were, I guess, at the time more kind of organic, and we were wondering whether this still remains relevant, and whether and remarking that the turns have seemed to have disappeared now. There's less of a kind of approach to canonizing as there was then. So anyway, we thought to look at what that context meant at the time, but also what's been happening since then, and thinking about formal educational and institutional settings. We remarked that there was a shift away from kind of the more conventional education and art environments that were more male-centric at the time. These have been replaced, though, by more neoliberal ones, which skip over the relational space and ways of doing things. And then we also commented on the 2-year cycle of education, how it creates a situation where it's difficult to create kind of long-term processes and continuity. So anyway, we decided to approach this by grounding our questions in our current contexts and practices, and in thinking through what we're engaged in now, and how this relates to education as a broad topic, and thinking about formal and informal learning processes, and how these run through our work. We also thought to do this through starting to think through a kind of lexicon of terms, which we'll get to later, and to start exploring this in a kind of less linear way, let's say, through a kind of mapping or a kind of web. But we thought to start by grounding this within our individual practices in the and related organizations that we're working with. And maybe, Annette, you can go to the first.
Emily, just a quick, because we need to increase the volume a little bit. Is that possible? Maybe you continue speaking, Emily.
Yeah. Well, here you see just a picture of one of our workshops.
Emily, also, like, sorry to interrupt you. Yeah. If you speak slower, because then the echoing in the room is also quite.
Okay, I will. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Rijksacademie, as it's my current working context, where I've been working for nearly 5 years. One of the very special things about the Rijksacademie is that we have incredible workshops, as well as an amazing community of artists. We have 50 artists in residence throughout the year for 2-year residencies. And just to give you a sort of idea, here are some pictures of some of the workshops. So artists come for 2 years. They're coming from all over the world, and they can collaborate with different technical specialists in our workshops. And we also have a lot of artistic advisors visiting. And of course, you have peer-to-peer learning and exchange happening as well. I thought to show, I think, oh, stop there, Annette. Yeah, so I think when we started talking about education, one of the things struck me moving from a more discursive environment, which was the showroom where I was working in London, where we worked a lot with more kind of process orientated and kind of performative research driven practices. At the Rijksacademie, I dived into an environment which is very much a kind of making environment because of these technical facilities and specialisms. And I found that interesting to see how artists come into kind of learning through making and through dialogue in a way that they are trying to form a kind of, let's say, visual language that connects to different kinds of research. So it was certainly interesting for me to see that more kind of open-ended approach to making. But one of the things that we felt was missing when I started was that we weren't really, we were very much, we weren't facilitating the kinds of practices that involve kind of social engagement. So we set up a couple of years ago a social practice workshop, which is led by a specialist, Elke Outenhuis. And the idea is that it's the same principle as the other workshops, that she basically facilitates artists who come to her with specific questions around the practices that relate to collaboration and engagement. And it is also about trying to enable long-term processes. And one of the things that we discussed in our conversation was about these kind of 2-year educational, let's say, periods, which on the one side at the Rijksacademy, it enables a very kind of open-ended period of research, practice, exchange. But on the other side, there's a constant cycle of people coming and leaving. And so a bit like where we worked at the showroom, we worked with a lot of artists where they set up quite long-term processes, and we took on the relationships that were developed through those as an organization and continued them by introducing in new relationships. We have been doing that with the social practice workshop. So one of the examples I can show is a project by an artist called Donghwan Kam, which is, if you scroll up. So while he was in the residency, he built a kitchen as a kind of object to begin with. And then if you scroll along, scroll down again, he installed this in a kind of underused area of our building, and it became a kind of social space where all of the artists could cook and socialize. If you go on down again. So it became a kind of quite nice convivial space, but it was very much geared towards the actual residents in the building. So it was also a kind of quite closed social space for them and their friends. But upon him leaving the Rijksacademy, Elke decided, we just formed a relationship with the local social center, and she basically offered it to them that this kitchen, she and him, I would say, she and Donghwan collaborated to take this out into a social center. If you go on down, scroll down, oh yeah, no, again. And then they started a lot of different kinds of cooking workshops, and it's still, I think it's still there in this boost, it's called, which is basically a place that facilitates or gives support to people who are coming to the Netherlands as refugees. So I think one of the things that we started to, through, well, Elke initiated, is to kind of, let's say, allow this open-ended time at the Rijksacademy where different ideas and practices are nurtured, but then to see how we can kind of extend the potential of those projects in different social settings after the residency. So another project that came up, if you go on to the next slide, an artist, Wouter van der Laan, who's a Dutch artist, who set up a weaving workshop in his studio over the time that he was at the Rijksacademy, because we didn't have weaving facilities. And then when he finished, he was actually planning to, he started doing weaving workshops in his studio with other artists, and then he was planning to set something similar up outside of the Rijksacademy, but Elke invited him to stay longer. And if you scroll down, and we did a 6-month guest residency with a collective called We Sell Reality, which is a group of artists of different stages of asylum processes, having all come to the Netherlands as refugees. And so they've been working on this over the last year, and it basically will head towards a kind of clothing project that they've been developing that will also go out to another space in Amsterdam called Framer Framed. And the other one that's coming up is an artist called Peng Zhang, who's a Chinese artist who comes from a rural farming background. If you go down. Who calls himself a farmer artist, if you go down again, who's been kind of experimenting with growing vegetables and kind of farming processes in his studio. So if you go down again, we started a new relationship with an ecological garden on the outskirts of Amsterdam on formerly polluted land. You go down. And there he will have, they're setting up a new residency in a kind of temporary mobile home kind of house where he'll be working for 6 months as well. So basically, these kind of, one of the things that I think we started to discuss in relation to these kind of projects, but more broadly, is the question of context, because one of the things that the social practice workshop did was to enable artists to somehow access a wider kind of social context, and for us to bring artists into those situations. But I also started reflecting on, through this conversation, about the kind of proximity, let's say, between art and life when you're working in a residency, because when the artists come, they don't leave the context behind. In fact, they bring, and you can see with the way in which these artists have worked. And so I think that's always one of the things of the kind of balancing act of how do you come from somewhere to somewhere, that became interesting to me as the residency, because there's, in a way, how do you go from thinking about, let's say, art and autonomy, because the Rijksacademie has quite a kind of, in a way, it's very studio practice centered, and the studios, have a kind of blank slate when they arrive, and it takes time for artists to kind of try to work out where they are, but also how do they relate to the place that they've come from. And because we have a very wide global representation in our community, there's often a lot of moments when different global events are kind of triggering different kinds of pressure that to kind of I think it triggers a question about where you are. For example, we have artists coming from places in the world where there's different kinds of crisis happening all the time, and there's always this question of how do we engage with that as a community and offer solidarity and exchange. So it means that when you work in an environment like this, you're not only you're very connected to what's happening in the world through hearing about lived experience from all sort of different perspectives, but also you are trying to forge a link to where you are. So anyway, that's my my part, and I'm handing over to Annette.
Thanks, Emily. So in the script, it's me now. And so maybe I can give a quick view on what we are trying to do here. Obviously, we are thinking about a third cycle of the conversation that we started 2007, and we are actually in the middle of it. So this is by no means kind of like the ending of the conversation, but you are, so to say, live in a particular stage of the conversation, very unfinished, very incomplete, and we hope to bring in maybe also from the conversation then moments of reflection or input. So basically how it has worked is that then so what Emily was kind of elaborating now, she also wrote down like big trajectories of what you have heard, and I would respond to her. In my response, I would say, of course, reading your introduction, now hearing it again, your paragraphs, Emily, thanks a lot. This is very interesting for me, working as still course leader of the Master Fine Arts program at the Utrecht Art Academy. Many aspects resonate that you bring forward as learning context. I recognize the 2-year cycle, the work on materiality in quite well-equipped workshop spaces that demands attention and the wealth of experiences that enter the learning community through what the students at the master bring with them from their diverse contexts all over the world. There are of course also major differences between the Rijksacademie and the Master Fine Arts in Utrecht, which are the more formal curriculum at the master, that structures the program at an art academy in the Netherlands. The difference is certainly also in the prestige and privilege that comes with studying at the Rijksacademie, but also the different funding models that undergird both studies, just to name a few. At the master, it has been a major challenge for me and the team to think and work through how to respond in a sensitive way to what you describe as the presence of global turbulences when people from diverse contexts meet regularly over a longer time. There's a certain invocation, for example, by the art academies in the Netherlands, that these contexts have not so much to do with art studies. And what I mean by that is that these contexts occur in art academies, not surprisingly, in the administrational, bureaucratic, and study development departments, where visa regulations, different funding schemes, moderate tuition fees for EEA European students, high tuition fees for non-EEA students, housing crisis, mental health conditions are predominantly dealt with, as if this has nothing to do with the core of studying, nor artistic practice. Once the team and me understood that we need to respond differently to the conditions at place, we have embarked on quite a journey. When a group of people from different contexts actually come together, we need to pay attention to how we come together and what each of us brings with them. We try to bring these processes and topics to the core of the curriculum. This bears challenges. We get challenged by each other, by each other's routines and habits of thinking and doing. We get challenged by the wider institution. Nevertheless, it allows us again and again to ask, how do we want to work together and see it as a part of the artistic learning community, of artistic practices, and all of these driven by individual collectives' aspirations, desires, ambitions, and routines. This is what I call the context makes the curriculum. One of our team members, Christina Della Giustina, phrased it in one of our curriculum writing sessions as how to work from encounters in a world that we never fully grasp. In this spirit, I'd like to describe the master in Utrecht as studying and holding tensions with different contexts, understandings, misunderstanding, a wealth of translations, while developing artistic practices that imagine these encounters amongst us differently. And then I asked Marina, how is your experience as lecturer in the UK?
So I'll say a little bit about my context, which has lots of salient parallels, but also some very significant differences from both the European context that we've heard about and the art academies and residency programs, or the examples of those that we've heard about. So to begin with, I guess I would need to say I don't work in an art academy, but in a university that has an art department. And that art department is maybe one of the more visible and recognized parts of that university, which is Goldsmiths in London. Also because we have an art institution that has recently sort of extended the work and the research that happens in that department, the Center for Contemporary Art at Goldsmiths. And I guess the sort of also very illustrious and notorious history of the art department. But I don't actually work in the art department either. So my relationship to art education is actually quite mediated or attenuated in my everyday work. And certainly compared to my relationship to art academies and other jobs I've had, like working at the Master of Fine Art at the Dutch Art Institute from 2014 to 2018, or even as a visiting lecturer on the Moving Image BA at the University of Brighton before that. So at Goldsmiths, I'm the course leader of a MA broadly within the cultural studies side of the Department of Media, Communications and Cultural Studies. And the course is called Culture Industry. And that course is really very much about what's a kind of infiltration of a genre of program in the UK and elsewhere, I think, called like cultural and creative industries. So it's a little bit like a Trojan horse within that kind of program. So, because the course focuses very much on the kind of critical theory heritage, I guess, of the concept of culture industry. So it's very much about, and on a practical level, it's a theory praxis kind of structure of the course. It's on the theory level, it's very much about the politics, subjectivity, valorization and organization of labor of work in the field of art and cultural institutions at all kinds of scales and from all angles. So it also very much sort of exposes students, many of whom don't actually have much of an academic background actually, to all the theoretical disciplines and empirical issues that define the experience of working in the field of art and culture, not just in Europe, not just in London, but also in this kind of like global neoliberal art industry in a way, and developing criticality in one's research and participation in that field on an individual level, on a collective level, and on a structural level. So working in the UK university, it has very defined course and assessment paths in those departments, and that really differentiates it from art education, even at Goldsmiths. And the whole pedagogical process can feel quite anonymous and industrial. So I teach on an MA, which extends for a year, just 1 year, actually, not even 2, full-time, 2 years part-time. But most of our students are international and they have 1 year's visa and they do it full-time. So it's incredibly dense and compressed as an experience, with a group of students that are mainly re-professionalizing themselves, you could say, by getting a postgraduate education or re-entering education after some years of professional activity in some cases. It's quite a small course. In the last years, we've often not even had 10 students on the program. But as I already mentioned, most are international, most are East Asian, most of them are women. Non-binary is an identification that has come up, but quite seldom. Most are in their early to mid-20s, although you do have older, mature students too. The course did used to be a bit more heterogeneous in terms of background before COVID and have more students on it, but this sort of like a small group of East Asian women in their mid-20s tends to be the default mix. So really what I think the course tries to do is to dig into the students' desires and motivations for being there and to reflect on their conditions of labor in the so-called cultural and creative industries, which of course also includes academia in this line, but of course also their conditions of education, and to do this through reading and writing, but also by dislodging the students out of their academic comfort zone. You could say through what we call the research lab, which is the parallel component of the course that is run by Josephine Berry, and that is about developing independent creative research forms in and out of the workplace. Meaning, for example, students can be assessed through intermediate and final projects that are creative or that are like more organization related rather than conventional written MA dissertations. And in years to come, we would like to formalize methods of workers' inquiry in the class, which my colleague, who's an organizer with the Art Workers platform in the UK, has been developing also while he's been covering my teaching while I've been away for much of the last couple of years. So the fact that the last few years have been consistently disrupted as well, if not by the pandemic, then by local, which means at Goldsmiths, and national industrial action in the UK at universities, kind of triggers that process of really reflecting on conditions of labor also within the education space. But of course, those reflections will not unfold spontaneously or be shared or articulated spontaneously. And there's definitely a divide between how students relate to political questions in their education as implicating them personally, if they're undergraduates that are around for 3 or 4 years, or if they're overseas MA students on a very punitive and very expensive restricted visa of 1 year. Which is not to say that solidarity with striking lecturers, especially in the context of students self-organizing that we've seen in the UK, like rent strikes, fee strikes, and complaint processes undertaken as a group, has not been happening. And they may be coming, and students might also be coming, on the other hand, from national contexts in which political activity of any kind is deemed quite hazardous. So going to university in the UK may be a space to explore other ways of engaging for those students, or they may choose, and they often do, just to keep their heads down and not get involved. But it is true that things get tougher year by year in terms of living and working conditions, in terms of costs in the UK, in London, at Goldsmiths. And even students that are supported by their parents to come and study abroad may be very focused on predetermined individual goals, and more so when classes are canceled or assessment postponed, which it often has been, and so forth. So I guess this is all to say that collective forms and processes, the more reflexive moments and possibilities in education, just having even unstructured time to think to make, to have conversations, to hang out. All these things have become quite fragile and under attack and hard to access in light of the material conditions that determine our activities in this educational and social context. Which is not to say they're not there or they can't be found, but like anything, they need time, space, and commitment. And of course, it's not just the university and its demands that students and staff have to reckon with, but housing costs, work, so many things that conspire to create this feeling of relentless pressure and individualization in a place like London. So I'm not actually sure who I'm transitioning to now, but yes, Emily.
I have to say, listening to Marina makes me realize how privileged we are at the Rijksacademy, which is not in the education system. It's actually a post-academic program, which is an artist residency funded by the Ministry of Culture, so not the education system, which allows for a great amount of freedom because there isn't the kind of pressures of accreditation. There's not a kind of curriculum, and there's no sort of measuring, let's say, of or kind of set goals in terms of only about artistic development. Moving on, we decided to approach the conversation, as I mentioned before, by grounding our questions in our current context and practices and thinking through what we've engaged in and how this relates to education as a broad topic, both formal and informal questions of conditions running through all, as well as context and how building context influence what happens in these many sites. So we decided to try and explore a few words as a kind of beginning to build a kind of lexicon or glossary in relation to the issues that have surfaced from our initial reactions to the topic and coming together. And I will start with the word context, since it seems to be one I've mentioned already a few times. So working in a highly international residency program, context has become a key factor, as I talked about before, when you're thinking about mobility and the importance of paying attention to context. As I mentioned, artists coming from one specific context to another. They're bringing themselves and their practices, but they're also coming with their lives and a cultural context that's not left behind. And yes, I already kind of covered part of this earlier. But I witnessed, how important this is to start thinking about this in relation to practice, but also how we as an institution can kind of embrace this, because we have such a diverse community. It's difficult sometimes to find the kind of level in which we can kind of create a space that is able to be home to great deal of diversity and people coming with radically different positions. So I noticed that what comes up a lot through the practices is actually lived experience, and I think that's something that's very central to the work of many of the residents. It's what they kind of depart from, and it's the way in which they find a way to build practices that are close to themselves, that allow them to find a way to speak through practice and share knowledge and experience across a space of difference, that does also enable forms of solidarity. And I think that also distance of coming and working in a different context is also something that enables people to try to reflect and speak. So this is one of the things that came up in a workshop that I was part of recently between some residency programs, both from Europe and from the Global South. And we were talking about the challenges of how do you create an environment that the one side is kind of open to everyone, and at the same time to be adaptable towards the different kinds of needs that come with people when they come into a residency. They're bringing their lives, and often they're coming from precarious contexts and cultural contexts that require different conditions. And it was interesting that at a certain point, the representatives of the Global South pointed out that the turbulence that we were bringing artists from into relatively calm environments was actually the context that they were working in all the time. So their question was about how do you create kind of safe spaces for artists within these more turbulent contexts. So anyway, this became a kind of topic, and it also struck me that recently there's a lot of change, obviously, in the kind of decolonial movements around museums, collections, where there's an introduction of context into how we look at art and how we are changing the way in which we need to see things in institutions in more contextual ways. And I was thinking specifically about the reactions around the rehang at Tate Britain, where there was a real questioning about the introduction of more social history. So we talked about this in relation to education as well, in terms of the different types of education in relation to, let's say, the more old-fashioned banking model versus co-learning, co-creation, different kinds of exchange. So shifting from, let's say, the educational turn to the web, the educational web, as is referenced by this project in Hamburg, and thinking about relationality. So thinking about a web being a constellation of practices that implies or creates context. And Annette brought up the Ivan Illich term, the educational web. So we started thinking about the web as a kind of multi or unidirectionality, which links to decolonial thinking around relationalities. And Annette moved on from there to talk in more depth about the educational web.
Yes, so one of the terms was indeed the educational web that I took up next to the term critical literacy and unlearning. And I will only go very shortly into the educational web. Lab is also interesting in relation to that. So what Emily was saying with the relation to turn, and I think Nora already mentioned that, so that the turn implies this shift away or towards something. And however, we were kind of exchanging on the possibility of that the web actually implies a multi-directionality, which is interesting. And for me, it links as Emily said, decolonial thinking and the talk around and the elaboration and scholarship around relationalities. And it also linked back to some work that I did around Ivan Illich's deschooling society. And it was particularly a quote that I used in one of the texts where he used the term educational web in a way that I found quite interesting, and I linked it to another term. But before I say that, like what I also think is interesting about the multi-directionality of web, that of course it brings also up imaginations around more rhizomatic thinking. And as far as I know also is that Ivan Illich's deschooling society, and especially his text tools of for conviviality, has been well studied by the rhizomatic thinkers. Obviously here the symposium's title, Educational Web, refers to that. Published in 1971, Illich critiques rigidity, authoritarian structures, and universal claims of educational institutions that make actually, in his views, meaningful learning impossible. And he developed a concept for a more democratic educational system that tries to destabilize a fixed hierarchical disciplinary educational system in favor of a more horizontal, decentralized mode of address. And I would like to quote him: educational webs which heighten the opportunity for each one to transform each moment of his living into one of learning, sharing, and caring. I bring the term up. We hope, I'm still in the quote from Illich, we hope to contribute concepts needed by those who conduct such counterfoil research on education, and also to those who seek alternatives to establish service industries. And that was 1971. Today, in my ears, this sounds like wording around lifelong learning that is majorly used by European funding schemes. In fact, back in the days, it was deeply rooted in radical student movements of the 1960s, 1970s that took up Illich's thoughts and actions. So the demand around self-determination in critical pedagogies inspired the demands of student movements to introduce greater autonomy as understood in learning environment as self-determination into universities and schools at that era. And these movements then struggled for a more egalitarian society and less hierarchical structures in universities and other institutions with more democratic participation in decision-making. And as we all know, meanwhile, it did not take long that conservative and neoliberal actors in the university reversed actually the pledge. So once the institutional critique of student movements was deprived of revolutionary references and the quest for justice, the implementation of the remaining critique would allow for more influence by the market. Or to put it in from the perspective of critical pedagogies, what is not appropriated is at the core of critical pedagogies, namely is the inseparability of self-determined learning and the quest for social equality and justice. And I think this inseparability of these two together is actually where a challenge lies for me at least, to bring that in again and again, for example, at the master. Why I brought in the critical literacy, and I will not get in so much. It's really a term that the master and the team with the students, we are circling a lot around. And in a nutshell, what we mean by that is that we do not only read words, but worlds. And what does this mean? And the term goes back to Paulo Freire. Bell Hooks took it up, and there's a lot of scholarship around it. But then, of course, the question is, what does it mean for us today? I would like to go into the third term that is quite dear to me and has challenged me a lot in the last 10 years. So I arrived actually at processes of unlearning because I have been struggling with the concept of learning. And it's especially its default understanding of learning. So for me, this default understanding of learning is an accumulative understanding of learning that is based on an acquisition and possession of knowledge, skills, and behavior. And I got particularly interested in this taken for granted concept of learning in relation to theories of change. So for example, what are the concepts of learning that permeate art practices involved in educational processes, and how are they related to conceptions of transformation and social change? And I don't think it's a coincidence that this expansive model of learning, so the acquisition of knowledge, behavior, and skills, fits very smoothly with knowledge economies in Europe that are based on growth. And these considerations were certainly important for experimenting for me with processes of unlearning. And I just bring that up as a background. I have been involved in 4 long-term projects around how to actually approach processes of unlearning. And there's one, and I call them sites for unlearning. They are experimental sites that I engage with groups of people. The one is Site for Unlearning My Library, Site for Unlearning Art Organization. So what are the organizational skills and processes that we need to be involved in order to work together and live together differently? Site for Unlearning Swatipede. Swatipede, Black Pete, stands in for Site for Unlearning Racism. And the last one, Site for Unlearning to Ride a Bike, which very much speaks to the incorporation of knowledge. So by working on these processes of unlearning, I'm drawn to cultural practitioners, including teachers, pedagogues, activists, artists, that share a perspective on education, not as the solution to a problem, but as being the part of the problem. But then not departing from it, but still trying to be in the midst of it and engaging with educational institutional practices. Furthermore, I've been studying processes and theories of learning with regards to concepts of progress and development. And my question here would be, to what extent do progress-oriented developmental pedagogies uphold forms of coloniality? Accumulative, expansive concepts of learning, and here also historical learning, very much bolstered up concept of progressive historical development. And for example, philosopher Amy Allen elaborates on this entanglement and relates it back to concepts of progress that emerged right at the moment when Europe declared itself superior to other people, cultures, and actually used these models to legitimize their our civilizing project. And my intuition or doubt and struggle is that we are, of course, living in the midst of that. Many of these processes we call also modernity these days. And post-colonial feminist scholar Gayatri Spivak has unpacked many times the narratives that modernity has produced and that have become quasi-truths for us in the Western world. And Gayatri Spivak also coined the term of unlearning in the 1980s, and I actually also try to stay very close to her understanding of learning. And there's something that comes up again, what I already mentioned with the radical pedagogies, because what she actually, how she understands it, or how I understand Spivak, maybe that's better, is unlearning as a relentlessly working through one's own histories, assumptions and prejudices. And now comes the inseparability again, in order to face and tackle injustices in a globalized world. So, and I'm saying this very with an emphasis, because in the whole hype around unlearning these days, especially in academies, especially in the cultural world, this inseparability again gets separated very often, so that unlearning is simply taken up as for the sake of unlearning. But for Spivak, it's very clear it has to come together with this quest for social justice. And when I talked about, okay, when Spivak says working through one's assumption, prejudices, and histories, what could she mean by that? And very often she's actually quoted on that with, yeah, what she means by that is becoming aware of something. And I'm actually questioning that. I don't think that she only means becoming aware, because we also meanwhile know that it's not enough to become aware. And Nora also mentioned that with the whole process and structures that are built up around criticality. What I would add to it is actually, if it's becoming aware, then a second process has to be part of it or juxtaposed by it, which I call more clumsily attending to, paying attention, staying with what's actually happening, staying in the tension, bearing the tension. And the third one, which is really actively on the part of trying to get rid of it. What is very important for that, while the becoming aware speaks actually in the direction of a consciousness project, a rational project, attending to, getting rid, might speak also to other registers, affective registers, artistic registers of any part. And there, for me, there is something that where I see a clear link, or that I would like to link post-colonial scholarship from Spivak with decolonial scholarship, because this attending to, in comparison to the becoming aware and this working through of affective structures, other registers, ask for a asks to speak towards how we experience the world, how we perceive the world. So it's not only about looking into what we, for example, see, hear, and smell as part of cultural processes, but also how we do that. So I have learned to experience, and these experiences are coupled with judgments, and I've learned to feel attracted to certain things and dislike others. And I just would like to mention one, because, well, I'm still based in the Netherlands, and there's one really important scholarship and book at the moment by decolonial scholar Rolando Vazquez, Vistas of Modernity. And he states that the circulation of power has been very well studied when it comes to question of gender, race, nation state, or capital. And what he adds is actually that the study of aesthetics as a field of power has not been enough studied. And when he talks about aesthetics, he does not only mean it in terms of representation, but also with regards to experience and perception. And for me, this book makes a case that modernity has constituted itself through colonialism, while at the same time invisibilizing it. And the ways we have learned to experience and perceive the world is crucial to that. So modernity taught us in the West how to look at the world, hence vistas of modernity. And we are still in the midst of it. We are still living in a regime of experiencing and perceiving that is based on what is called the modern colonial matrix of power. Our lives, also institutional lives, are infused by this. And I believe we are only at the beginning of facing it. So unlearning here helps me to stay focused, attentive, as a tough reminder of the work that I need to do. In the end, it is a threefold process: unlearning as becoming aware, attending to and getting rid of taken for granted truths in order to tackle forms of oppression. And now I was asking Marina to bring in her terms.
Should we go to that term in the glossary? On my screen, I think it looks a little bit strange because you can't see the full slide.
One is coming. Wait a sec. No, I cannot do it from this computer.
Oh, it says enter full screen there. No, okay, anyway. So the terms that I would like to foreground now, kind of in a relational way, rather than first one then the other, is industry and autonomy. And I'd like to take these two terms, which can be taken initially as maybe as opposites in a way, or they might sound like opposites, as kind of parameters of a field of forces and shifts, as we find it in art and education. As well as art education. So art and education here understood in an institutional sense, as well as kinds of activity and organization. Organization meaning of labor, of perception, of ethics. And there, Annette's reference to Rolando Vasquez and how, as she says, he studies aesthetics as a field of power. And then not only in terms of representation, but with regards to experience and perception. That really resonates with how I want to introduce these terms, and how we can think about that shaping the expectations and the experiences of those who are involved in studying. So teachers and students in the immediate situation of learning, and also insofar as that explicitly or implicitly can include moments and modes of unlearning. Which is to say, the expectations and experiences, such as what power is held by the student, by the cultural worker that they are or are intending to become, how they see themselves as an individual or as a member of a collective with regard to those processes of formation, you could say. And the question of power there is where industry and autonomy can be seen to interact, right? Especially in the field in which the industry in question is structured so profoundly by ideologies of autonomy. And here you can refer primarily to the art field, but also the field of higher education itself. So there's a kind of pedagogy of exceptionality in those spaces, of exemption, kind of often quite unacknowledged, but structuring references to kind of humanism and freedom, and those are quite tenacious at the level of form and habitus, kind of the unthought, the unreflected upon, in a way that at the level of representation, at the level of discourse, how those kinds of assumptions are very much deconstructed and critiqued might belie how tenacious they are at the level of institutional and ideological kind of interpolation. And so when I was just mentioning power, I mean how participants understand their agency. So the power to, you could say, in relation to what they see as a kind of immovable condition of the conditions of the field that they're in. so a kind of power over, I could say. And those conditions are often experienced or approached as intensifying precarity and the need to adapt to it. So what seems really key about the whole discussion about learning, now as before, like going back to when we were first started having this conversation years ago, is this focus on the unthought, the habitual, of how behaviors reproduce the impersonal structures that create the reality effect of a field at levels that can seem impossible to intervene in, especially as collective structures or organs of a kind of counterpower can seem so ephemeral and hard to access if they exist at all, be that sort of trade unions or self-sustaining independent spaces that can serve as spaces of socialization of resources and conversations. And this kind of constant sort of evasion of the fact of the industrialization of the field by this pedagogy of autonomy, this subjectivation of autonomy, is in a way kind of simply core to the space of the art institution as a social fact in Adorno's terms, in global capitalist modernity, or now global contemporaneity, if we think about Peter Osborne's work about art and about contemporary art and globality. So the way we understand the specificity of art as a form of labor and activity and institution has to do with its difference from industry, its distinction from industry, even as we recognize its sort of everyday integration into the culture industry at the level of institutions such as the market and education. So this duality, a kind of practical heteronomy or dependence on those institutions, and autonomy or independence in principle or self-understanding of the field and its agents, is the paradox which establishes its particular social niche and perpetuates it, and also informs its particular capacities, whether those are critical or material. And so art's dependencies are mediated as its independence structurally, even when it thinks about and prioritizes forms of entanglement as its self-understanding at the level of concepts or methods or practices. And this often is this kind of split that happens in education programs in particular. So another quote comes to me that I heard recently, Alice Kreischer, who's a German artist who's been around for a long time, making really interesting material and political, individual and collective work. And that quote is, she talks about self-determination is the ability to choose your own dependencies, and that being like something you can do as an artist, perhaps. So, and I guess that's something we can discuss or query. So I guess this is a kind of, she's pointing to a kind of political horizon that has its roots in feminist debates in reappropriating dependency or heteronomy as a collective praxis, but one which, is in a way also quite problematic in lots of ways to situate oneself in relation to. So in lots of ways in this conversation we've been having with Emily and Annette and myself, I kept kind of coming back to like feeling compelled by this idea of how to measure or account for the period that has elapsed since we first started having this conversation in 2007, 2010, and what coordinates we can use to measure that time or to measure what has changed, which Emily was already talking about at the beginning. So my location in the UK feels like my experience of education as an infrastructure in art is really skewed towards the industry rather than the autonomy side of things, as you've probably already realized. And not only because I run an MA program called Culture Industry, and because there's an ongoing state and market fetishism around cultural and creative industries in the UK, whether that was like during the New Labour period or even kind of it's making a comeback now in a small way, relatively small way. Goldsmiths has most recently been part of a substantial UK state grant trying to revive this kind of early 2000s rubric of the cultural and creative industries. So the industry side of things for those reasons, but also because of someone located in the university humanities department, in the kind of cultural studies niche, rather than an art department or residency program, I don't actually directly work with artists and how education matters to them or how it shapes their self-understanding as a theme or as a course of study, but I'm working with students of all backgrounds. So cultural managers, curators, designers, brand consultants, marketing people, or even academics. And both on breaking down what the conditions of the field of cultural production in some of its broadest scope might be. So going through discussions around cultural work, but also coloniality, urban gentrification, and art, race, and how they can participate in, affect, and change those conditions. So as I already said, the format of this education is super industrialized comparatively to other forms we've heard about. So the 1-year MA, if it's full time, a set of mandatory written assessment points, very, very high fees for a predominantly international student cohort, anchored in flows of mainly Chinese students that keep basically sustain the Ponzi scheme of UK higher education. It would collapse tomorrow if it wasn't for international student fees, given the way it's been leveraged by the UK state. So this perhaps can have the interesting effect, as it does with the university system in the UK as a whole, of demystifying the conditions of these students' labor as students and as cultural service industry workers, and making the conversation around labor and organizing more intuitive and relevant in some ways than if these students were A, socialized as artists, and B, had a cushion within the welfare state or within cheaper education from the conditions of their reproduction as students. But I'm getting away from my point, which is also about what has changed between the late 2000s and now. Obviously, in the UK, years of austerity intensified by COVID and a greater systemic reliance on private wealth with it, and this is what has changed in the field of art institutions as well as universities. And there, in the field of art institutions, ever more stringent accounting mechanisms for support of spaces and projects, accounting mechanisms that are often mediated in terms of ill-defined and cynical social impact requirements, and the corresponding surge from the side of institutions at all scales to try and game those kinds of metrics. For the ever-diminishing public funding that remains, and then of course from the Tory government, you have kind of percolating ever more kind of culture war anxieties that can be reflected in institutional self-policing, as we often see with different examples that have happened, such as the Wentworth at the University of Manchester about a year ago, a bit more. At the same time, there is a kind of emergent common sense for a lot of younger and not just younger cultural workers and students around working conditions, unionization, and anti-racist agendas amongst cultural workers and some artists, as we can see in the research and organizing that's been going on at the Barbican around precarity and racialization of staff. So maybe I'll continue. We can pick up on those kinds of examples later, and I'll turn over to Emily again.
Yes, and also maybe I can quickly with eye to the time.
Yeah, I was just worrying about time.
Exactly.
Maybe we could skip to Marina's examples because I think those
or we can give like glimpses in what we would have done, which we will do in the conversation. We can go to some questions. Maybe that is.
Yeah.
Emily, would you like to give a really, really short, where the conversation is heading between the three of us?
Well, we started talking about kind of life, art, life, mental health, the kind of, because I think the thing that struck me amongst many things when Marina was talking was about the kind of self-reflexive form of education where the context is kind of part of the education to be able to reflect on yourself as a as a subject, let's say. So we started talking a bit about Mark Fisher and his role at Goldsmiths, and life conditions. And then I did basically ask at the end, could we have any hope? It seemed quite bleak. So where are the practices that we think are transformative and kind of taking us to new places? And Marina came with some nice examples, as did Annette.
Yeah, so Annette, do you want to go first, or shall I go first?
No, well, I think I'm actually suggesting that we are not going into it, but that we open to the public for some questions, and having that as a kind of backdrop of what we are elaborating. And hopefully, like, I mean, my hope is that this conversation we will kind of finish in some other circumstances, and then it is possible to access it then. Would that make sense?
That's good for us too. So maybe we just have about 5 to 10 minutes before we have to switch over to the next lecture. Does anyone like to start?
Hi.
Maybe I should just say about what we're looking at. This is like a little slide of montage, or like a collage, I guess, that I made in terms of like kind of examples I felt of kind of inspiring sort of forms of organizing, like grassroots organizing in London, and spaces as well, like Mayday rooms, in the last few years. That was kind of in response to Emily's question.
Hi, thank you so much for that. Also, this kind of a scope and scale of your personal history within this discourse is really impressive. And I think something that I would be interested in learning more about is that this exhibition, of course, proposes a kind of decentralizing impulse that happens in certain types of smaller communities set against the backdrop of globalization, of neoliberalism, of new imperialism, of new colonialism also. And a lot of those processes today happen via technology, information technology in particular. How has your work been affected by the rise of sort of digital bureaucracy in the past 10, 15, 20 years within institutions and educational programming? And do you sense some of these impulses also happening within technological formations in your work?
Who would like to respond? I'm looking to Marina and Emily. Someone wants?
I don't have a real, I don't feel like hits me so strongly in my working environment.
I mean, for me,
I mean, in terms of the digital, let's say. Yeah.
I mean, I have one experience. I mean, the reason, so when there was the possibility to, this job of the course leader of the Master Fine Arts program in the Netherlands came up, and when I decided to well, accept or apply for the job, it's not directly because of that, but it was because I am very interested in this nexus between what is possible with working together in an institution, a quite rigid neoliberal institution, with a team, with students together, what you would call, now I'm making a shortcut, classroom education, and the more managerial part. And this course leadership is exactly on this nexus. And I would say that the managerial part is very much, I mean, by one part of what I understand by digital technologies. I mean, just like 2 weeks ago, we mapped all the technologies that we only use in the master, and we came down to 18 different platforms that we are using that all have somehow a recurrence in the managerial apparatus. and I'm saying this not because I think, oh, this is bad, but I think for me, there is a different work to be done in the classroom education with a team and the organizing together with the students and in the managerial part, because how I experience is that a division takes place and the call comes from the management. So like, I mean, the way the whole job is actually structured is that there's a very clear border wall division between the two parts. And my whole work actually in the last 6 years happened around how to let these two fields interact and basically also a little bit observe, I mean, basically the call to order that happened towards me, the calls from the institution of not wanting what I said in the very beginning, questions around visa regulations, questions around housing policies towards the institution. But what happens if you stay strong on that and you keep pushing? I don't think that there are solutions happening, but there are different forms of organizing happening, and ways of suddenly fields and questions appear that weren't there in this way before. And I basically, I mean, in a very bleak way, I also understand, or I read it in the direction of Excel sheets. So it's kind of like master of Excel sheets. But it is something that I really also realized in the last year, that a literacy there is also makes it possible for me to push back and to read back these sheets and to ask questions.
Great, thanks. Are there any more questions?
Hello, and thank you very much. I would like to go back to a term that Emily mentioned. Hello, Emily. Which is safe spaces. And I wanted to ask how you are dealing with the increasing request and the increasing need for safe spaces. And I also wonder how, or if safe spaces can also be learning spaces for those who don't need them, for those who don't experience dissonance and ambiguity on a daily basis, but actually for those who cannot tolerate ambiguity.
That's a good. It's a good question. Actually, interestingly, certainly in my environment, that discussion about safe spaces has kind of died down a bit. And I think it's to do with the fact that during the pandemic, there was such a kind of high level of anxiety, and since then, we certainly put a huge amount of effort to kind of making sure that, without using the term safe space, because I really think it's a false promise in a way. You know, I don't, like in terms of what you can really enable. But I think to create the situation where everybody can kind of speak up about things, anxieties or things that aren't working, or, like, I think in a funny way, the safe space is not, in our case, it's not about having a kind of demarcated space. It's actually about everyone being able to be themselves and be comfortable and feel like they have someone who listens to them, and things happen if there's something that's not working, or, so that's in a way how we kind of try to create an environment where there isn't that kind of tension. But of course, as Annette said, the tension's always there. It's about being in them and working through them. So I'm not sure if I answered the question, but actually that topic, when I was talking about the workshop we had with residencies from different parts of the world, certainly in Senegal, the person working there, they had to shut down a space and open up another one, like a physical space, in order for artists they were working with who were from LGBT backgrounds to be able to be literally safe. So the meaning of safe space is also very different in very different contexts as well.
I mean, just thinking about that quickly, I wonder if, like, my thoughts combine the last two questions in a way, because whenever I speak to my students, who, like I said, are predominantly from China, they don't feel that either online or offline, even in the UK, is a safe space for them, especially in terms of like articulating political opinions. So they also feel like anything they do here might have repercussions for their families back home. So like digital sort of like management, kind of, you could say like the online space of sort of self-expression and community building kind of clashes in ways that they're kind of quite habituated to from their experience in the sort of Chinese online space. And those kinds of concerns and anxieties, and perhaps rightly, or I think maybe rightly, quite often follow them to Europe and their education in the UK.
I think maybe we have time for one last question, if there is one, or else we would move on to Laurence. Anyone else? Well, thank you so much for this lovely talk.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
So sad not to be with you in person, but hopefully soon.
Sure.
Yeah, sorry to be giant heads.
See you soon again.
Yes.